Hello there ladies and gentlemen, gamer boys and girls, welcome back to the pod. This month's bundle was shortened by 2 games and caused quite an uproar in the community. Humble's reasoning was that they included games in this bundle that are standing out from a quality point of view, and they are still achieving the expected value of $200. And that's why there are only 10 games instead of the regular 12 they had advertised during this year. So let's see if they have made valid points or not, and let's jump right into the November 2021 bundle.
First things first, early access. Beware. Keep your distance. Kill it with fire before it lays eggs. Not only that, but it's an early access title that was supposed to come out of early access months ago, yet still has not done so. Definitely not something to be applauded. Nonetheless, let's take a look at what it's supposed to be. Dueprocess aims to deliver a fast-paced, multiplayer-only, tactical FPS experience. Think taking 1 part CSGO, 2 parts R6 Siege, and sprinkling it with a further 1 part procedural generation. The Counter-Strike part would be 10 players controlling almost identical puppets as their avatars. I say almost because there's some slight differences between the 2 sides. Attackers are bulkier with an additional 50% HP per player, but in exchange, defenders are faster, for example. Siege would deliver the core gameplay concept part in the form of tactical FPS gameplay. Except, in this aspect at least, Dueprocess actually outplays Rainbow Six, and the tactical part is much more enjoyable and important at the same time. Last but not least, instead of having set levels that would come up, there are set level canvases, so to speak, and each match would fill these blanks with procedurally generated elements, thus keeping things fresh and hopefully limiting the viability of learning every single pixel peak on a given map. Independent of whether you're an attacker or on defense, you'll start the round looking at the map of given level. This is your opportunity to analyze the entry points, figure out the routes to the objective, and come up with a strategy to either get to the bomb or to keep it safe from the attackers. Based on your and your team's discussions, you'll start gearing up, grabbing yourself a primary and a secondary weapon, 2 additional accessories such as barbed wire, flashbangs and so on, and if you're on attack, you also have the option to grab headgear. While everything here is free, the amounts available of each item are limited, and all weapons and accessories are dropped on death. If there's only 1 AK available and you die with it, next round there will be no AK available. Only possible out would be if either a teammate of yours picks it up instead of the weapon they brought, or an enemy picks it up, keeps it for next round, and in that case, if you manage to kill them, you can take your precious weapon back. Last but not least, following the gearing phase, the round begins, attackers will start maneuvering towards their chosen entry points, while defenders will attempt to use these precious seconds to throw down barbed wire and find a good spot to hold. Note, they aren't busy jumping out to kill the attackers in the open, before those even have a chance to play the game. As a defender, leaving the building results in death. They're also not busy peeking spawn points, as they rarely ever even have a window to the outside that would be destroyable. More often than not, windows looking outside are bulletproof. These 3-minute rounds are both action-packed, as you have to keep moving as an attacker if you don't want to run out of time, but at the same time, you can't just brainlessly rush it unless you're an absolute alpha chat squad and manage to catch the defense completely off guard. Core gameplay has real potential with a proper group of players, but I also had fun with the random dudes I got teamed with. This is probably mostly due to the community seemingly being more mature than most FPS titles can boast. Everyone was kind and welcoming, no one had any issues with having to explain basics to newcomers, and I haven't been flamed a single time, despite delivering bottom tier gameplay every now and then. Sadly, they are also kind of forced to do so, as the tutorial in its current form is complete garbage. Other than showing you how to press W to move forward, it barely explains jack shit, especially anything with actual relevance. During my first game, I just picked up a weapon and ran in without a single bullet to my name. 2 games later, a random dude joins the match, and we can suddenly hear 2 minutes into the round, "Holy shit, I have no ammo!" Let's be real, this should never ever be the case. If you're hellbent on players having to pick up the ammo themselves, at least flash a damn red warning on their screen before they run into the match. Other than this, well, and the clearly not even near pretty graphics, I'm actually curious whether dueprocess ever leaves goddamn early access, and whether it actually becomes something. Based on my short experience, as long as they keep on top of weapon balance, add an actually useful tutorial for the new joiners, and manage to bring in a solid player base, there's really not much keeping this title from being a better Rainbow Six Siege than the original.
Bullet per minute. There are flashbacks that the video game panorama never disdains, especially when it comes to proposals aimed at filling some void left by real genres that have disappeared for entire decades. Wanting to brush up on the forgotten canon of the rhythm game, for example, Crypt of the Necrodancer, had already thought about it, with its brilliant mix of mixing the dynamics of a roguelike dungeon crawler with the rhythmic and musical nature of a deadly dance without stopping. From this point of view, BPM, bullets per minute, therefore, doesn't have the merit of the absolute novelty, but if nothing else, it represents even a more daring attempt to retrieve and modernize the styles of rhythm games. And the result is bombastic! A mix between frenetic action, procedure progression in roguelike style, and jarring guitar solos that ignite the atmosphere at every turn. The devs aim to add to the already very original Crypt of the Necrodancer formula a fundamental element: the shooting. With this, we can feel like we're playing Doom with the rhythm aspect, also because there will be monsters crawling and jumping towards us almost every second. Even here, in fact, we will find ourselves routing waves of aberrant creatures originating from the mouth of the underworld, having to perform ballistic acrobatics in the oppressive arenas. Initially, we will only be able to play as Gull, a very blonde and rocking Valkyrie armed with a 9mm. As it will be necessary to complete some specific challenges to unlock all the other heroes, who have different weapons and statistics. Once we set foot in the first of 7 dungeons, however, the charm of a modern and sparkling rock opera will prove more than pervasive than ever. Roaring guitars and heavy drums will punctuate the continuous bubbling of hot lead, giving the experience of an epic and combative hard rock extravaganza. Just like in Doom, part of the ecstasy of the carnage was accompanied by the background music, which ranged from classical heavy metal to the more experimental gent. The gunplay revolves around this simple assumption: the trigger can only be pressed on the beat of the quarters, in unison with the invisible metronome of the soundtrack. Otherwise we will have nothing but a dry and empty noise to replace the explosion of the bullet. Fortunately for those who have little rhythm in their blood, it is also possible to rely on the aiming reticle, which with continuous movements recreates its trend, indicating when is it possible to fire. This transforms the clashes to a more moderate, more calculated, but not less exciting bloodshed. What distinguishes the guns in BPM is not only the difference between parameters such as range and damage, but also the rate and method of reloading, since these will affect the timing of the weapon. In a certain sense, it could be said that every instrument of death has its own metric. Guns, for example, fire 1 shot at every beat, using 2 for reloading. But the revolver, to be ready to fire, needs 6. 1 for each shot, we insert 1 bullet into the drum. All this makes each weapon unique, and it will therefore be of a fundamental importance to know the timing of each of them, well, at least in order to master them during the clashes, since the rhythm with which the pressure is exerted on the trigger will have to take these differences into account. Although the shooting system adheres smoothly to the aforementioned rhythm game mechanics, the overall experience remains faithful to the roguelike nature that forms its basis, and which meanwhile brings the longevity of the title to an extremely variable value. Dungeons are procedurally generated and can sometimes be completed much faster than others with just the right amount of luck. Enemies are many and have a great variation. These are mostly insectoids with simple attacks like charging or jumping from afar, and it is remarkable that their offensive and movement patterns also follow the rhythm of the music. Sadly, the boss fights doesn't shine for inspiration in terms of design, but they remain articulated clashes and they are capable of giving many satisfactions from a playful point of view. Although BPN is a great game, it has its flaws, namely the visual aspect that for me is just flat out repulsive, and then there's the story, or rather the total lack of it, but I could regard the lack of the narrative as a focus on the gameplay. Bullets per minute responds to that nostalgia that all lovers of rhythmic games have long cherished, placing itself halfway between a first-person shooter and a roguelike. Its music kicks ass, and the focus on the gameplay makes this game stand out in its genre. I have to mention that this was the only game I have played after the 3-hour mark, and it is still installed on my PC. So pick this if you fancy shooting monsters while listening to rock music, and you want to test your rhythm precision.
Möbius Front 83 is a cute-looking turn-based tactics game set in the US of the 1980s. In the single-player campaign mode, you'll fight through a series of battles, leading a relatively small squad of units whilst uncovering the story of Americans invading American territories. In practice, this'll mean you load up a map, deploy a starting set of units based on what's on offer for current map and how much points you're given. You will then take turns with the AI to move your units through the hex-based battlefield, fight your way through the enemy forces, and accomplish given map's main or side objectives, such as capture specific hexes or eliminate specific units. As far as the first 3 hours, following a super casual tutorial section with no proper enemies really, the game started showing real potential by instantly punishing my careless commandeering on the first real level. This also remained true throughout my playtime, while even the harder, or in this case standard, difficulty of the two is relatively easy to get through. To do so, you better take your time, otherwise the AI won't hesitate for a second to punish a cocky move. Now in practice, this tends to translate into a somewhat drawn out feel. Pushing forward hex by hex isn't the most action-packed of gameplay experiences, but I guess it does have a vintage feel of trench warfare that might appeal to some, as might the setting of the 1980s military technology. Should you get bored of the single-player campaign, there's a sandbox mode where you can set up battles according to your taste or mood. If you have a buddy who also owns a copy, this is also the place to organize a 1v1 fight between the two of you. Unfortunately, that's also the limit to the multiplayer experience. If you don't have anyone in your friends list to invite directly, it's a bust. At the same time, however, if multiplayer isn't your cup of tea anyway, there's also a few other activities you can partake in, should you need a break from the campaign. One of these would be playing a single-player card game, think Solitaire but with a different rule set and scoring system. Another, more interesting option would be reading through US military manuals from the past. These come in PDF form and claim to be as real as it gets. History buff might want to consider the title for this feature alone, and just unlock them rushing through the relaxed difficulty settings. With a pleasant to look at, cartoony visual presentation, a non-outstanding but perfectly suitable soundwork in the background, and mildly challenging, as far as patience goes, gameplay, while Möbius likely won't turn your world upside down, if you're looking for a classic looking and feeling war-themed tactics game, well, this might just be it for you.
Houseflipper. Well, I wouldn't have thought that I will be playing another renovating kind of game after that sad incident with train station renovation, But here we are, so let's see what Houseflipper has to offer. We are basically workers who work to renovate houses or carry out small maintenance jobs. Our goal is to make money by working for others or by buying properties in a state of semi-abandonment to resell them after they have been fixed. We will be installing radiators, fight off cockroaches, cleaning up after people, or redesigning rooms by demolishing walls. In some cases we will be also called to furnish rooms, and furniture can be bought in the game store, anything that is asked by the customers. For example, on a mission I had to fix a bedroom for a little girl, repaint the walls, buy a cot and a changing table. The game system is really simple and usually requires a simple click on the object. When you grab something, the interface suggests on the screen all the actions one can take. In short, despite being a simulation, in Houseflipper carrying out various actions is extremely simple. Do we need to paint the room? Easy. We buy the paint in the shop, place the bucket in a place that is convenient to reach, take out the roller, dip it and we can paint the wall. The game also includes a character growth system, in which the more we perform certain actions, the more expert we become in the specific field. For example, if you spend a lot of time cleaning, you can spend experience points to view trash and dirt on the minimap more easily, so you don't have to go crazy looking for them. Or you can become faster and more efficient in painting, greatly speeding up the work. Or you can get more money by bargaining with the customers, and so on. In short, Houseflipper is much deeper than it may seem, and becomes even more so when you start using all the tools available, and when you must assemble the most complex objects. The assembly phase is quite linear, in the sense that once an object has been positioned, we just have to click on the illuminated parts to move on. The challenge offered in this regard is really low, but the accuracy placed in reconstructing the various phases is commendable, so much so that you might learn some DIY stuff unknown to you. The best part of the game, however, is the complete renovation of a house. It is true that it requires a huge amount of work, but taking a shack and transforming it to a habitable place gives a great satisfaction. From a technical point of view, however, we are faced with the most classic of simulators. Aseptic and ultra-realistic graphic style, well-reproduced objects, very bare outline elements, a functional interface whose functions are linked to the usual tablet, a solution now widely used and already seen in other simulators. In conclusion, it is a very solid product, so if you are intrigued I advise you to consider it. It is a simulation game that stands out, and for me is a casual fun kind of thing. Houseflipper is a title that does what it promises. The most important thing, however, is that it works. A very rare feat when it comes to simulator games. Yes, there are a few bugs, and for some reason the game always stops for a sec when I pull out the tablet, but these are minuscule problems. Also, in my opinion, there is a need for a few more objects for furnishing, but there is no doubt that as a formula it is more intelligent and exciting, and most importantly, it works. So pick this if you like a decent simulator with a sprinkle of DIY and enjoy flipping houses.
Well, I'm fucked. SpaceRockets 2 is a spacecraft builder / simulator, a genre that I never play as I'm not even the least bit interested in it. Just like Contraption Maker, Kerbal Space Program and a handful of others, this title will also go into my builder library on Steam to never see the light again. Either way, I'll try to walk you through my tutorial experience, but I'm afraid that's the extent I can talk about this title. First things first, the tutorial itself is pretty good. It explains both the base concept and the basic controls of building your own spaceship. You'll start off with your control center, slap on some fuel tanks and connect engines to be powered by said fuel. For the sake of aerodynamics, you can add cones, and to further pimp your ride, you can also add electronics. Once you're done with the assembly part, you go into staging, where you'll calibrate the order of activation for all the elements on your ship, Or, in layman's terms, you'll instruct your pilots to start their flight by using the most outer engines instead of the ones in the middle. Once you're happy with your little baby, you're supposed to take her out for a drive, and there's also a separate tutorial on how you're expected to do so. You activate the different stages you set up earlier. You'll have these navigational circles to assist you in setting pitch to gain more and more lateral speed, and if you don't completely botch everything, the end goal you'll be aiming to reach is a crash-free spaceflight, maybe orbiting Earth or visiting other different planets. Now once again, I have absolutely no prior experience in the genre, so I couldn't for the life of me tell you whether this is a better or worse title than, let's say, Kerbal. What I can tell you is that the tutorial was fine, graphics aren't jaw-dropping, but they perfectly convey the feeling the game is going for, and I didn't experience any technical difficulties playing. Do you like building rockets? Do you enjoy fiddling with angles, tweaking numbers, attempting to simulate trips through space? If so, why not give SpaceRockets 2 a go? I absolutely see no reason not to do so.
Project Wingman. Project Wingman is not just reminiscent of Ace Combat. It obviously follows the formula of the great model when it stages gripping dogfights without descending into the depths of a simulation, and it does so in a pleasingly high quality way. It doesn't reach new heights, but it is a nice game nonetheless. So it's high time we got into the cockpit to secure the fictitious airspace. The virtual world is fictional because although it is ours, its story is different. The Cascading Republic on the west coast of North America breaks away from the Pacific Federation, and it triggers an armed conflict that the newly declared independent country cannot endure on its own. Cascadia therefore hires mercenaries to increase its military strength, including a pilot whose role we take on here. His or her colleagues are also part of the party, whose radio messages and briefings are used to follow the events of the 20 or more missions. Don't expect a cool staged Top Gun movie though. Voices without faces are all that Project Wingman brings up in terms of narration. And this is especially noticeable where the mute alter ego of us appears like a ghost without character and cannot even be seen in the profile picture. But who needs talking when you can fly jet fighters? Of course, it has nothing to do with a simulation. Simply accelerating is enough to take off, and all the displays and feedbacks are shown in a greatly simplified manner. And with over 150 missiles on board, the jets are also better equipped than some of the capital ships. And in parts this simplicity is quite regrettable. The HUD and acoustic feedback could point out the dangers clearly, you barely take damage, and you don't really have to pay attention to enemies firing at you. Apart from these, it is not always possible to distinguish marked targets from other displays quickly enough, and switching through all enemy objects in an approximate viewing direction is far too imprecise as the only manual target selection. When you're sitting in the cockpit, you can hardly tell when flying through clouds whether your nose is pointing towards the ground or towards the sky. It also applies when flying overseas. Vertical markings on the edges of the contour lines could change this but are missing. Only when it comes to flying does Project Wingman hit the bullseye. With finesse you swing the fighter from one side to the other and still think you're in a realistic airplane. The basic physics work so well that you feel like a flying ace while pulling enemies out of the sky in a row. Usually you turn simple circles, but also use complex maneuvers at higher levels of difficulty in order to use the rockets as efficiently as possible and to point the machine gun at an attacker at the right moment. You don't necessarily have to keep an eye on the thrust though, although you will gain decisive advantage through well-considered acceleration and braking. I also think the staging is great, when you fight just before the sunset over a besieged city, or in the rain under the low-hanging clouds and watch the water flowing on the cockpit windows towards the stern. And also, I couldn't forget the muffled bang of explosions can only be heard after a short delay from a distance. In other words, as little as that applies to the narrative, the actual game brings life to a romantic Top Gun romance that is as glorified as it is still down to earth. Pick this if you'd like to shoot enemies down from the skies and you want to relive your Top Gun days.
This is another one of those games that I'm set to have to review, because it couldn't be more obvious how much love and effort went into creating this game, but yet I'm mostly just glad my time with it is over. Core concept is a top-down casual adventure game, one that for majority of the time reminded me of Stardew Valley, but take away all the farming and related chores and keep only the part when you're running around to do favors for others. You control this turnip dude, oblivious as fuck with anger issues, resulting in instantly destroying any and all papers that he gets his hand on. As a direct result of this, he also shredded his tax papers, landing him pretty much as the pet slave of Mayor Onion. This high-profile position on a daily basis results in having to run around and collect different items for the mayor, for him to fulfill an unknown plot, and while you're at it, you might as well help out others with their little issues as well. Now, while phrasing it like this sounds as if it were optional, reality is, most of it isn't. To progress, you'll have to help most of the other veggies. For example, Mayor wants you to find him a fork. To do so, you have to get into a house, but you'll need to tackle the lack of proper stairs. You can get hold of a footstool, but to do so, you'll first need to find the missing baby carrot. You get the drill. As long as you enjoy an endless stream of fetch quests, the game is alright, I guess. Except, you'll also have to be able to deal with the humor it presents, which definitely isn't my cup of tea. The sort that I like to think is just trying too hard to be cool with the kids, thus ends up being a pointless, humorless mess of memes and stepping out of the box wink wink sentences. To top this all off, it's also super short. The story part you can get through in roughly 2–2.5 hours, which leaves you with two options moving forward. A. You go back to grab all the collectibles, which is actually lightly assisted from this point on, as there's a cave where you can get hints from. Alternatively B, you can now play a roguelike version of the game. If you hop onto the endless thingamajig train, you have to keep beating room after room of enemies, seemingly infinitely? I can't confirm the latter, don't quote me on that. What I do know is that it starts out quite dull as the combat is super easy, but has the potential to actually become challenging later on as the enemies become stronger and stronger. The absolute strong suit of the game is its visual presentation. The sprites are super nice, the sound work does its job, nothing to frown at, but personally I didn't enjoy the music at all. Rounding it all up, Turnip Boy commits tax evasion isn't something I think people should go out of their way to have an opportunity to experience, which is a crying shame seeing all the love put into it. However, if you're not sure what to do with your life for roughly 3 hours, just install and play through this title, as it's good enough for a why not type of afternoon.
Timelie. In recent years, so many innovative and attractive independent games have been released, that even for such works, the competition is much harder than before. A game like Timelie, if released a few years ago, might have caught the attention of many gamers, but now it has nothing special to say. Time control has long had a special place among video games and had been used many times by different creators in different ways in their games. This time Timelie has tried to use this power with a new approach, but it has not been able to meet the expectations. A game that can generally attract the audience for a few hours, but by no means can it be among the best indies. Placing the main character in an unfamiliar environment and not providing a specific explanation until the game is finally concludes is one of those game-making techniques that has now become an epidemic. Usually these games easily and without providing less explanation focus only on creating atmosphere and practically withdraw from the continuation of the story. The same approach applies to Timelie. The problem, however, is not the story or the lack of a specific narrative for it. The atmosphere created for the game shows the distant future in which a girl has to face a large number of guard robots to escape. This is perhaps the most cliched image that the game focuses on, and although it provides a good visual result, it has nothing to say in creating something similar to the atmosphere seen in a work like Inside or other similar games. The biggest negative impact on the final quality of the effect is directly related to its bleakness in specific areas that could make a difference. The only part of the main body of the game that has been able to shape these conditions to some extent is the gameplay. The part of the game that is at first can be promising, but quickly loses its original appeal by repeating it too much, thus creates boring conditions. Playing with time has been known as a successful formula for years, and it is usually enough to use it properly to significantly increase the overall gameplay values. Here, however, in the game, the main foundations of the gameplay are based on playing with time, and this issue can create a new feeling in the audience. This feeling of excitement, after a short time and with too much repetition, replaces itself with boredom. Timelie is a stealth puzzle game in general, and it tries to implement the basic principles of this style, which is to stay away from the guards and reach the end of the stage. Unlike other similar games which usually offer fixed forms on how to progress in the environment, Your Next Studio gives you the steps in which the path, timing, AI patterns, defined capabilities and other points must be put together as a puzzle. In principle, each stage of the game is a separate puzzle that has fixed rules, and only from a design point of view it is possible to distinguish them from each other. The main difference of this scenario becomes clear when the main character acquires the ability to control time in the very first minutes. Each step has a specific timeline, and you can move it back or forth at any time and finally realize the right decision. Basically, failure doesn't make sense in this classical sense anymore, and if you see that your behavior has no way to success, you just go back in time and try a different way. As the game progresses, it tries to add a little depth to the gameplay by adding a cat as a secondary character that has the ability to display different behaviors, but again with too much repetition. Timelie's simplicity is evident in all its parts, and presentation is no exception. The game's graphics and sound meet basic standards, but have nothing new or different to say. The game underestimates its ability to present new points in all areas and sees all its strengths in the big shadow of the story. The Timelie experience can be a lot of fun for many, and I generally was okay with it, but it won't be my favorite, nor will I remember it in the future. Pick this one if you are thirsty for a puzzle game, otherwise you can leave it on the table without any problems.
2019 saw the release of one of the most popular board games of recent years. Disguised as casually collecting birds, under the hood what you really wanted to do in Wingspan was to build an engine that was better than anyone else's at passively generating resources and points to end up the highest scorer at the end of the game. Like many others around the globe, I also love playing the physical copy of Wingspan, and besides terraforming Mars, that's our go-to when we gather up for a fun gaming session. On the back of this history, I immediately became excited when I saw the digital version in this month's bundle, and being familiar with the rule set and genuine gameplay, I was already sure it's going to be a top scorer unless they somehow messed up the port really bad. Spoiler alert, they didn't. I won't go too deep into the gameplay, otherwise we'd be here all night, but for the sake of a quick and dirty overview, here's a rundown of what the game is about. Your main goal in Wingspan is to have the highest score between all players by the end of the 4th round of the game. You'll gain points from placing birds on the board, from various side objectives, and from a few other activities. As for the bird placing part, there's obviously a cost associated to doing so. First, you'll need to actually draw bird cards to play, then you'll have to supply their food requirement, and last but not least, you'll have to pay the egg tax. You'll be able to fulfill these needs visiting the different zones of the player board. For example, food comes from the forest, or bird cards come from the water biome. That's really how simple the core concept is, but don't let this overly simplified rundown fool you. The skill ceiling is insanely high in Wingspan. Now, going back to the port, first things first, there's a fairly straightforward tutorial included that will teach you most of what you need to know. I just wish the tutorial presenter character wasn't so fucking ugly. Given the complexity of the game, I don't think it will be enough for completely new players, but for further practice, these folks can play against the different levels of AI until they feel they have a solid grasp on what's going on. And from there, you can graduate to the intended multiplayer experience, either locally or online. Local multiplayer is quite self-explanatory, let's move on to the online aspect. You'll have two options, either real-time or asynchronous multiplayer, with seemingly zero estimated waiting time to get into a game. Latter is a game mode intended for those with limited time. You join a game and have 72 hours for each of your turns. Obviously, if everyone in given game has taken their action for the turn, you don't have to wait for the actual 72 hours to pass, that's just your limit. As for the real-time matches, the time limit for each turn is more akin to something you'd sit through, as these would be 3-player games with 5-minute turns. Based on the experience level of the participants, length of these games can vary between, let's say, roughly 45 and 70 minutes, but to reduce your downtime, you can either play multiple games at once, play anything else and get a Steam notification whenever the turn comes back to you, or, as always, you can just practice some patience, sit back and relax while waiting. Other than the previously mentioned tutorial lady, visual presentation is spot on. While it's not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, it perfectly brought over the vibe of the board game. I came across a seemingly recurring visual bug multiple times in the form of my birds just flat out disappearing during another player's turn, but changing biomes solves this issue, so while mildly annoying, not a deal breaker. Music is relaxing and sound work doesn't distract or disturb too much. I only have one complaint about Wingspan, to be perfectly honest, and that's the lack of DLC availability. You see, the physical copy already has 2 expansions released, one of them expanding the available selection of birds, and the other introducing new features and making the game overall better. I'd love for these to be available for purchase and play in the digital version as well. But even until this becomes reality, I see absolutely no reason for anyone to pass on Wingspan. If you're at all interested in board games, birds, or anything really that's being presented here and catches your eye.
Seems like an old school shooter is trying to climb back to the top, as I have just met with the Quake engine from my childhood again. Was it a nice experience? Well, let's talk about wrathaeonofruin. In the cycle of guns, horrendous monsters and intricate levels, the historical 3D realms together with 1C entertainment offers us Wrath, an FPS inspired by Quake that focuses on difficulty and precision rather than on frenetic shooting. From the point of view of the gameplay, Wrath doesn't move much from the mechanics already seen in the titles of the genre. With a fighting system that takes advantage of the movement and the sudden change of weapons, as well as the collection of vitality and armor to be able to stay in life. However, there is a substantial variant to this shooter, namely in the save system. Yes, the favorite weapon of every self-respecting FPS player has always been the manual saving. thanks to which it was possible to try again and again particularly difficult fights. On this, Wrath removes the carpet from under our feet with a limited save system based on the objects called soul tether. These will be scattered around the map and allow us to save the game by leaving our soul anywhere in the level. At first this system confuses, especially veterans like me, who are used to being able to press the glorious F5 button just to quickly save the game. Often I have forgotten about this system, I was moving forward in the level and then crashing badly in having to start all over again. The soul tether make Wrath a very reasoned and at times strategic game. You will have to try to collect those scattered around the level and use them wisely, as it is still a limited resource. For example, you could decide to place one after having faced a particularly difficult fight, or before a section where in a previous attempt the monsters have made you sit in stripes and forced to start the level from the beginning. In addition to soul tethers, there will be also save points called shrines in the huge levels of Wrath that allow you to regain all those vitality and save the game. Sadly, this save system will be problematic as the game can be pretty hard at times, making you sweat and start levels all over again if you're not careful enough. The game starts with classic cannon fodder zombies, following by classic shotgun wielding demons and wacky monsters with a mouse-mounted plasma gun. Already these two types alone can knock you out if you're not careful about how to manage them, mainly because they have incredible aim, so if you don't do a bit of a healthy old strafing, you can be sure they will catch you. Then we move on to the terrifying widow that charges you with its head down. Even more annoying are the flying monsters that will attack you from the above. Moving to the next tier, there are some beautifully deformed monsters that vomit acid, and some hideous flying creatures that, in addition to shooting fireballs, they will also try to chew your head off. Wrath certainly has no problems throwing all this nice bunch at you in the most difficult and bastard combinations you can imagine. Among other things, if you only try to reach a secret area, the game teleports you to new demonic troops to make your life even more complicated. I can't deny that although I think I'm quite good in FPS games, even just the first level of Wrath really made me sweat a lot. But the effort is quite rewarded when you detonate the evil beasts in a riot of polygons and blood, or behead them with a nice shotgun shot. To fight this cheerful rebel, we will have the classic arsenal of weapons. Shotguns and pistol are the foundations, with them we can crush demons like insects. Then we find a violent machine gun made out of fangs, a very clear tribute to the fantastic Quake nail gun. Instead of the grenade launcher, we will have a sort of a, I don't know, slime launcher I would call, a weapon capable of blowing up everything. It is here when Wrath transforms from a frantic FPS into something more tactical, where you have to be careful of the corners because in every room enemies could appear in large quantities. It happened to me more than once that I had to beat the retreat in order not to get overwhelmed. So until this point the game sounds quite good, but now let's talk about the bad stuff. Wrath is an early access title. The overall design isn't quite the most inspired. The enemies seem to come out of several assorted nightmares, and frankly, apart from the hideous videos, the other monsters have left me quite indifferent. Some of the more than menacing monsters are almost funny in their absurd deformity, even if they are able to kill you in less than 2 seconds. The weapons are quite generic at the moment, and the whole setup in the levels seems almost every time coming from the Gothic architecture. Everything was already used and seen. Even the main character says absolutely nothing and does not inspire much violence. In conclusion, at the moment Wrath is an FPS for fans of the genre who want to test themselves. The title focused to the maximum on the gameplay and behaves very well from this point of view, always keeping the player on his toes thanks to the save system and the treacherous enemies. In short, the game is fun, but in my opinion, it will take more work to make this game an amazing one.
Yes, we received 2 fewer games this month than usual. To be perfectly honest, I couldn't care less. Back when I started buying these monthly bundles, you'd get 8 or 9 games a month, and that was perfectly fine, but I believe we're gonna have a separate discussion piece on this topic, so let's not waste any more time on it. I think our leading titles were supposed to be Dueprocess and Houseflipper. Well, that's quite a ridiculous boner killer if you ask me. Based on our experience, there was but one top level entry this month, Wingspan. Our monthly lows were Timelie and Turnip Boy, both of them proved to be boring experiences. Everything else sits in the midfield, even the 2 early access titles, as even those show some promise, but even so, we would still advise waiting for a full release before deciding whether to pay for those 2. A total of 19 points out of the maximum 30, no reason to try and hide it, the November bundle was average at best. Many of you have been asking for a comparison of some sort, where we would try to put given month's bundle into perspective compared to the others. Well, here's our first attempt at doing so, a quasi tier list of all the bundles released this year, and you can find the current one highlighted with orange. Well, as already mentioned, clearly not on top of things. As always, we'd be very grateful if you pleased the machine gods by liking our video. If you'd like to come along for our next review, don't hesitate to subscribe. Any and all recommendations are welcome in the comment section. If you haven't already, make sure to switch to winter tires, and we'll see you again next month.